I'm now going to introduce Vincenzo Iozzo and Michael Silva. So they're going to talk about how attackers compromise NHIs, and also we'll have a demo session which will be really insightful and give you some real perspectives on how easy it is to compromise and get into organizations.
Hi everyone, I'm Vincenzo, I'm the CEO of SlashID. We do posture and active threats detection for human and non-human identities. I'm going to talk briefly about sort of like the threat landscape, and then Michael will do the fun part in the form of a demo. Michael, if you want to, yeah.
Hey everyone, Michael Silva. I run solution engineering at Asterix. I see a lot of familiar faces, which is great, right? It means we're actually building a community here. My past 20 years, I do offensive and defensive security, teach people how to break in, and then people how to stop people from breaking in. So we'll go through Vincenzo's slides.
All right, because we only have 10 minutes. What I wanted to mention briefly here is that my background is originally as a security researcher, spent a number of years at CrowdStrike. As a result, most of what you're going to see in this deck is focused on threat actors and their behavior, as opposed to sort of like the management side of NHIs. So let's try to understand why identity attacks are so important these days. We've started to see this in 2019, and it's grown over the years. But 2019, the number of attacks that were purely hands-on keyboard, so no malware, was about 40%. Today, it's between 75 and 83%, depending on which report you want to look at. And most of the attacks we see that are hands-on keyboard, so without malware, tend to be identity related, either in the sense that they start with an identity breach, or that after the initial compromise, the attacker moves laterally through identity. And so kind of like this might sound trite, but it's becoming more and more true by the day that attackers don't really break in anymore, at least in the traditional sense. They tend to use stolen credentials and just log in. What I'd like to do in the next few minutes is just to give you some stats on what we're facing, and then try to explain why I think we are in this situation and what we can do about it. But just so, again, a few more numbers to make this real. So about 31% of all breaches out there tracked by Verizon have involved stolen credentials. And this, we're talking 33,000 breaches over the span of about 10 years. CrowdStrike, in the report, in the latest threat intel report, mentioned a spike of about 6x in the number of Kerberosing attacks that they're seeing. And then lastly, one of the data points that I find most interesting is that AWS, the internal CERT, released a deck at the last Reinforce, where they showed that 66% of all the AWS breaches that they've seen across customers involved leaked or stole valid credentials. So this was by far the number1 way in which AWS accounts got breached in the past few years. And so I'm sure some of you have tracked what happened with Tata Consulting in the UK and what's happening with phishing attacks in a bunch of different cases this year. But just to give you a sense of, at a high level, how these breaches happen. So generally, you have either some kind of phishing/vishing attempt or some form of a credential leak. This could be a human credential or it can be an NHI credential. Once the attacker manages to compromise the initial account or host, depending on the attack, they then use, more often than not, identity-based attacks to move laterally and escalate privileges. And this takes the form of often just credential or token harvesting of some kind. Then ultimately, depending on the attacker motivation, they either try to maintain persistence and stay stealth. This tends to be mostly nation-state attackers, or they run a ransomware campaign. This tends to be more like the scatter spider of the world. So how do these attacks actually start? So what we're seeing are three key sort of like vectors. One, again, is phishing or vishing. And we're all familiar with phishing in the original form, but what has happened in the past few years is that we've seen a significant evolution. The one side of it is using LLMs and generative AI to either create deepfake voices or have very convincing phishing campaigns. But the other part is also that we moved away from just MFA fatigue to phishing that focuses on more esoteric auth2 flows. So we're seeing a lot more auth2 consent phishing campaigns. The second one is linked credentials. We're all used to the basic, oh, there's an API key left in some public GitHub repo, but actually this has taken a whole new level. If we look at the breach that Microsoft suffered in 2023, that was actually caused by a private key in a crash dump that was stolen by what seemed to be a Chinese nation-state group. They used the private key to then forge valid auth tokens and move laterally in the Microsoft environment to compromise the State Department. So it's not, when we talk about leaked credentials, we're not just talking about just basic API keys left in source code, but we're getting more and more, we're seeing attackers becoming more and more sophisticated. And then lastly, supply chain attacks. We've seen multiple cases where an NPM package gets compromised and then people use that to start harvesting credentials and move in production environments. Once attackers are in, what they tend to do, so once they've compromised the initial account or host, they tend to move laterally again through various identity-based attacks. The first one and most common one is they tend to register a secondary MFA factor. This is what Scatter Spider does all the time to maintain persistence within that account. From there, they either create fake IDPs so that they have a root of trust that they can control to impersonate anybody, or they start using different token forging techniques, the most common one being Kerber roasting. One thing that I think is really important to understand is that when we look at breaches in general, the average time it takes to go from initial compromise to break out in the environment is about 62 minutes. And normally breaches go undetected for about 10 days. Interestingly enough, 54% of breaches are not actually detected internally. When you look at hands-on keyboard breaches, so identity-based breaches, everything I just said becomes significantly worse. So the dwell time tends to be a lot longer, and the number of breaches that is detected internally tend to be a lot fewer. So in most of the attacks, high-profile attacks that we've seen in the last couple of years, a breach was almost never detected internally except for the Cloudflare incident. So two quick things. What do we think? Why do we think that's the case? So back when I started in security, what we used to do was to write exploits for endpoints and so on and so forth. And that was by far one of the easiest way to compromise somebody, because the detection capabilities and various memory protection techniques weren't just that strong. What has happened today is that we've gotten so much better at protecting endpoints that identities all of a sudden become a lot more interesting. And specifically, identities suffer from three core problems. One is most tokens are still stateless. So what that means is once you've stolen the token, it's for you to take and do whatever you want with it. There is some work around binding tokens to devices, but it's still very early days, and we're way too far from widespread adoption. The second thing is most of the authentication and authorization protocols that we use are extremely complex. As a result, they have corner cases that are valid in the protocol specs, but actually lead to behavior that are undesirable from a security standpoint. We've seen some of the auth2 consent flow phishing attempts, but we're going to see a lot more. And then lastly, if you look at the stats around permission models, What we see is that for AWS alone, there are about like 15,000 entitlements. And so maintaining list privilege is basically impossible because writing policies that do not have, that are not overprivileged becomes an exercise in futility for the most part. So what this means is a broken permission model leads to a much easier time for an attacker to escalate privileges and move laterally in the environment, which is the other reason why identities are so much more valuable today than they were in the past. So a couple of things that I think we could do, and then I'll leave it to Michael for the demo. One, it's important to understand that identity attacks are not just about NHIs. Almost always there is a link between human and non-human identities, and attackers tend to move laterally from one to the other. So having full coverage for both is really important. Second, most IDPs today have some kind of audit logs. These audit logs are only partially useful and do not actually give you full coverage in terms of like most of the techniques that attackers use to move laterally. MFA and FIDO2 have brought us a long way in terms of like blocking phishing attempts, but clearly they're not enough. And so again, you need to have some form of ITDR in place to be able to detect some of the more sophisticated attacks. And whenever possible, moving to device-bound tokens really does help to make these attacks less dangerous. And then lastly, as I mentioned, one of the key properties of identity-based attacks is that it's so easy for an attacker to move laterally because over-permissions, most identities are over-permissioned. So having a way to auto-resize permissions often and frequently and continuously is another key way to block attackers in their tracks. I have some predictions, but I'm going to skip those because otherwise Michael won't have time. I'm going to be around for the rest of the day and the rest of the conference, so happy to talk to anybody who wants to talk about these attacks. Thank you, everyone. Sorry.